Now turning to our program, I am pleased to welcome Milwaukee Press Club President Mary Ann Lazarski, the editorial producer for Milwaukee PBS. Mary Ann will introduce our panelist and speaker.
Good afternoon. It is nice to see such a full house. Thank you all for being here. I'd first like to introduce our media panel. First, Charles Benson from TMJ4 News. Yeah, you can applaud. Jesse Opoyan from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And Matt Smith from WISN 12 News. Today we have the opportunity to hear from former two-term Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. He served as governor from 2011 to 2019 and later sought the Republican Party's nomination in the U.S. presidential election race of 2016. He is now president of Young America's Foundation, an outreach organization that introduces young adults to the principles of conservatism, such as individual freedom, a strong national defense, free enterprise, and traditional values. The foundation is a partner with Fox News in the first Republican presidential primary debate for the 2024 election cycle, scheduled for August 23rd at Fiserv Forum. Scott Walker has urged former President Donald Trump to take part in the debate. Trump, the current Republican frontrunner, has not committed and has said he might hold an alternative event. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage, Scott Walker.
Well, good afternoon. I'll try that again. Good afternoon. There we go. Well, good to see everybody here. I'm going to share for a few moments a little bit of personal information, a little bit of professional background, and then we'll turn it over to the folks who are going to grill me the rest of the afternoon. I kind of missed that. I just did a Fox interview this morning, and they asked me a few questions, but it was mainly about the debate, so it was kind of easy relative to my old job along the way. So hopefully you can give me some memories of the past. But first off, actually, being in this structure, I was thinking about 3 weeks ago, I had the honor, Tonette and I were traveling in Europe, and we went to Normandy. And we spent some time at the cemetery there. And thinking about that, anytime we travel around the world, but it makes me think back to this site, back to the days when I was the county executive. This Milwaukee County War Memorial's motto is to serve the dead, or to honor the dead by serving the living. And so to every one of you who are a veteran in the service of these United States, to all of you who are family members, as well as to all of you who continue to serve, about a week after, I had the honor of stopping to see a new home just outside of Oconomowoc, just west of that area, a little bit south of I-94. Jason Church, some of you might be familiar with, is a veteran of Afghanistan. About 10 years ago, he lost both of his legs, and the Gary Sinise Foundation, like many others, it's not just exclusive to them, built him a brand new home. Sometimes you'll see him standing because he's got artificial limbs, and then other times he's in his wheelchair. But Gary Sinise, like a number of the other foundations, makes these homes that are adaptive for our veterans. And so whether it's something like that, services that are offered here in Milwaukee County and across the state and across the country, thank you to all of you who've served as veterans and to all of you who continue to serve. On a personal level, just a couple minutes of maybe some updates. Last night it was kind of funny. I saw Charles, as you may allude to later, at the Wisconsin State Fairgrounds. He was going to a different concert. I was going for the usual quest with my wife and her girlfriends to see Herman's Hermits, but she had come early. It's the same old stuff every year, and it's just as fun every year. But she had come early, and I came a little after 5, and I pulled up in the parking lot by Gate 5, right in front of the Tommy G. Thompson Center. And you cannot plan this. In fact, had we planned it, it would not have worked out as well. But Tommy Thompson and I got out of our cars in the parking lot at exactly the same time and walked in together. And as you can imagine, one of the guys from the fair stopped and saw us both, and the look was like, and I said, it's okay. After 5 o'clock on Mondays, governors get in for free. But it was great to see Tommy. Obviously, he loves the fair. And then he made his way over. Actually, he ended up at Saz's. Tonette and I always meet up at Saz's because that's where we met 31 years ago at Saz's down in State. And we saw Sazama there holding court and a whole bit. So it was a lot of fun to see some faces and some names from the past. Our family now lives, we raised our kids in Wauwatosa, not far from here. When I was governor, we got, as a little bit of a respite, a pontoon boat on Lake Mendota. And so after 2 terms in office, we had to find a house for our boat. Any of you have boats know what I'm talking about. So we're on the west end of Pewaukee Lake. We just had, in addition to the work, I'll give you a little update on in a moment, but about a week and a half ago, our youngest son, Alex, and our new daughter-in-law got married out on Akachi Lake at the Golden Bast. And so my daughter-in-law actually lives a couple blocks, works a couple blocks over from here, and they live just west of town a bit. So it's kind of unusual to think about having a daughter-in-law at this point, but having at least one of our sons married. My other son, Matthew, I think is here. I've been looking around to see. Oh, there he is. Matt's over there. So Matt, just a year different in age from our son, Alex. Matt lives in Wauwatosa and has a business just down the way between the 3rd and the 5th Ward does digital marketing. So stuff I know hardly anything about. I'm glad he knows a lot about it, but Walker Media Agency. So glad, Matt, you're here as well. And Tonette and I enjoy our time in Wisconsin. But as you can imagine, with the job that I have now, it involves a lot of travel. And part of the reason why we're going to talk in a moment about the debate on the 23rd is Young America's Foundation is a partner with Fox News and the RNC for the first presidential primary debate at the Fiserv Forum here in Milwaukee on the 23rd of this month. The work that we do, and you heard a little bit of it in the introduction, I'd been a supporter of the organization far before the end of my tenure. In fact, my wife, we first visited the Reagan Ranch, which is one of the assets that they have out in California. If those of you are old enough to remember President Reagan, he actually had a ranch called Rancho del Cielo just outside of Santa Barbara in the mountains. He spent cumulatively one of his 8 years in office at the ranch called Rancho del Cielo. It's now the Reagan Ranch. So it's kind of fun. We kept it intact. 25 years ago this April, Mrs. Reagan chose to sell that facility because the president, as you know, at the time, post-presidency, had Alzheimer's, wasn't able to ride, which was his real passion. Any of you are horse riders can understand that. That was his passion. And when he could no longer ride physically at the ranch, she sought to sell it. And instead of selling it out to the highest bidder, gave it to the organization I'm now honored to lead, mainly because he had been involved with it even before he was a governor. Back in 1962, he got involved with the original group called Young Americans for Freedom. 2 years before that, it had started at the home of William F. Buckley in Sharon, Connecticut, and at the time focused on college students, which we work with about 2,000 campuses with college students around the country. But in '98, when we took over the Reagan Ranch, it was far before I was there, but the organization expanded to high school programs. In the last couple of years, since I've become the president, we now have a middle school program. In addition to the asset out in California, we have offices in Virginia. We have conferences in our nation's capital. And over the last 2 years, I was just down there a couple of weeks ago, we took over the home that President Reagan had in Dixon, Illinois. Actually, it was one of 5 homes. I just love pointing out to kids that Ronald Reagan's family never owned a home. They rented. His father suffered, as many do today, from an addiction. His was alcoholism, but they constantly were in and out of employment, and so they progressively went through 5 smaller homes. But to me, it's always a great story, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, or somewhere in between. It's the American success story, because he didn't come out of the elite class. He didn't go to elite colleges. He went to Eureka, a community college nearby, and ultimately not only became president, but arguably, if you look at the fall of communism, was one of the most impactful leaders in the 20th century in the entire world. And so we love sharing those things. We have conferences, we have events. We're the largest lecture series in the country. In fact, at the end of September 27th, we'll be at the University of Wisconsin in Madison for a lecture series with Dr. Art Laffer, who was actually an advisor to President Reagan many moons ago, who loves talking on campus. Dr. Laffer will be by then 82. And his grandchildren are now part of our programs along the way. So that's what I'm up to. when we're not out on the lake in Pewaukee with our family and with our work. One last thing before I open up the panel. It ties in a little bit, I think, about why we were asked to partner with the first debate. And that is, if you look last year, there was a lot of hype and a lot of attention about what many in the national media in particular called a perceived red wave going into the midterm elections. And there were a lot of pundits after the fact that said, well, why didn't that happen? And there's all sorts of reasons. As any of you who follow politics know, there's never one simple reason. But a lot of times, at least some of the national pundits like to peg one here or there. And so you heard for a while people say, oh, it was the quality of the candidates. And yet, quality candidates make a difference. Mayor, I'm sure you appreciate this. We like to think quality of candidates makes a difference in any election, be it at the local, the state, the federal level. So that had a bearing, but I don't know that that alone is it. I mean, if you look at Pennsylvania, I don't know that I would necessarily say that Senate race was circled around the quality of the candidates. If you say, oh, it was an issue, say, oh, it must have been the Dobbs decision, had to be abortion. Well, that certainly had a factor, but that wouldn't explain why every pro-life governor in America not only won, they won by a wide margin. And those governors, even more than members of the House and the Senate, actually acted on things related to that issue. And so if it was just abortion, that wouldn't have been the factor either. Otherwise, they would have all lost. And you say, okay, well, what was it? Well, maybe it was a combination of those things. But one of the things I've been kind of issuing a Paul Revere type warning to those who share my political beliefs is that I think it's one of those where there's an eye-opener when you look at younger voters, 18 to 29-year-old voters in the last midterm cycle in 2022. We saw it in Wisconsin, saw it in Arizona, saw it in Pennsylvania, saw it in Nevada and elsewhere. In those key battleground states, particularly in the U.S. Senate races, there's about a 40-point gap. Now, put that in perspective. When Ronald Reagan ran in 80 and 84, he actually won that category. When I successfully last ran for re-election in 2014, I took 47% of that vote. I didn't carry it, but it's pretty close. The person who ran as a Republican for governor in the last election here in Wisconsin lost by over 30 points, and in those other contested Senate races in battleground states around the country, it was 40 points or more. Now, some in the media after that all happened, because I'd been governor here, because, as was mentioned, I lasted longer than Anthony Scaramucci as press secretary, but it was a very brief tenure. I always kid, I said it again this morning, I was smart enough to get out of the race before I got a nickname from Donald Trump, but the rest weren't quite as bright. I look at that, so the media said, oh, he's run for president, he comes from battleground state, he leads his youth organization. What's the answer for Republicans going into future cycles? I may be stealing some of your questions right now. I apologize if I am. And I said, it's not as simple as some cool digital ad campaign. It's not just simply creating a student coalition. I would argue on my behalf, and those who share my beliefs or come close to that, that conservatives need to wake up and realize it's not about campaigns. It's not even just about the quality of the candidates. All those things help. It's about countering years of what I would label years of liberal indoctrination. We see it in the University of Wisconsin system. We see it in the private and public institutions around the nation. And that's not me in hyperbole. There's actually a poll the UW system did earlier this year that showed over 60% of the conservative-leaning students on campus feel that they're threatened in talking about their personal beliefs on campus along the way. There's actually, in that same poll, it showed that over 40% of the students who identified as very liberal said they don't think that speakers they disagree with should actually be heard on campus if they feel that their ideas are somehow a threat to their beliefs along the way. Now, I was county executive for a couple terms here. I realized that the county is much more Democrat than Republican, but I was honored to serve, and I think there were a lot of people that far more than Republicans voted for me. There were probably independents and even a few discerning Democrats. But we were in a position, part of the reason that worked was because people were willing to listen to different points of views and to have dialogue and discussion and agree that sometimes we're going to disagree on things and figure out ways of having common ground along the way. One of the biggest concerns and challenges I have in society today is, and this doesn't all apply, I'm kind of singling out some on the left in higher ed and sometimes in K through 12, but I would say it applies to some of the people who align themselves politically with some of the views I share on the right as well, that in this highly polarized environment that we live in, particularly when it comes to social media. I would love it if we just didn't have social media in some regards. Something that was supposed to be this great, town hall essence, largely now puts people into different camps, not only politically, but heck, you look at sports, you look at entertainment. It's it's kind of the polar extremes. Whoever says the wildest, craziest thing gets the most likes on things like Twitter along the way. Although I remind kids all the time, less than a quarter of all Americans are on Twitter. And yet a lot of times in the national media, when something's trending, they act like that's the public, that's the rest of us. It's not. Less than 22% per the Pew Research Service shows are actually on Twitter. And of that 22, 23%, depending on the year, 80% of the tweets are done by 10% of the people. So when you see something trend, that's maybe 3, 4, tops 5% of the entire population. And yet the rest of society, particularly many sometimes in the media, at least at the national level, treat that as though that's real life. And it's not. And so having discussions, not only the dialogue we'll have here, but discussions with all of you, I think is extremely helpful. One of the things I hope to do, I've always said, I said this as governor, I say this even more now as the leader of Young America's Foundation. I would love in all of our schools, our colleges, our universities, our public and private institutions, K through 12 and otherwise, I don't need to have people teaching conservative points of view. I have those, and I love sharing those. But all I'd love to have is just the facts. Just provide an education that teaches us about American history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We need to know about the bad parts of our history, but we also need to know how we overcame many of those parts and how we've got more to do along the way. I'd love to hear about objective world history. I think there's a lot we could learn in places like Ukraine if we really looked at what's happened generations before, plus or minus. And that's actually, Ukraine's one of those issues where I'm kind of up in the air. I know there's people strong feelings one way or the other. I don't know that there's a clear distinction as to what's exactly right or wrong. I think there's variations of that. But I think part of the problem we have in dialogue today is that all too often people immediately gravitate to one position or the other, and if you don't agree with them, there's just something fundamentally wrong with you. And I think that's damaging for all of us in society, but particularly I think we're selling our young people short if we don't give them the access to all the information. And sometimes that means hearing people they don't always agree with and might actually feel a little uncomfortable with. But that's certainly something I appreciated, and I think appreciated for my kids and others as well, that's how we learn and that's how we move forward. And that's part of the work that we're trying to do at Young America's Foundation. And for me personally, particularly in this state, in this community, I want that to continue going forward. I just want to say one last aside, and I'll turn it over to Brett. Good example of this. So before the 2020 cycle, I know some of my friends from around the country were a little surprised that I was advocating for the DNC to have their national convention here in Milwaukee. And I had a tagline, you guys probably heard me say this many a time, it's not about blue or red, it's about green. And I want to acknowledge the mayor in particular, but the city and the county and a lot of, not only elected, but other leaders here in Milwaukee kept that same mindset when unfortunately, not because of anything happened here, but because of a global pandemic, we didn't get to fully embrace the benefits of having a national convention in 2020. And I want to thank and acknowledge the mayor and the others at the city and county level for stepping up and saying, hey, it's the same thing. It's not red or blue, it's green. It's not only the dollars that come in, it's the impact on putting us on the map as a world-class city. You know, same way in the past we've talked about with the Bucks, with the Fiserv Forum, which I was proud to be involved with making that happen and working with city and county and local leaders as well at that time. That's something that's going to be remarkable, and we're reminded of just the early taste of that a few weeks from now on August 23rd. We have the very first presidential preference primary debate here in the city of Milwaukee because of the tradition of having that in the host city for the convention come next year. And so thank you to the mayor and everybody else who helped make that possible. And to me, that's a good example saying I don't have to necessarily agree with everything in the same way that I wasn't going to agree with everything that happened at the DNC convention in terms of policy. But I was happy that they were there, and I appreciate leaders who share that same sentiment. So with that, turn over to you guys.
Thank you, Governor. Let's start with the debate. Yeah. 2 weeks from tomorrow. Is Trump going to be there?
Well, I got asked this again this morning. Well, with Trump, you never know anything, right? I mean, you never know to the last minute. I don't know that anybody knows other than him. You know, I get asked, who talks to him? I said, I've talked to Ivanka, I've talked to Jared in the past, I've talked to others. Nobody really knows. Conventional wisdom would suggest that with the lead he has in the polls, he shouldn't show up. But there's nothing conventional about Donald Trump, right? I mean, this guy is the most unconventional candidate we've ever had. I can still remember 8 years ago being over in Iowa when I was briefly running for president. It was the day when he said horrible things about former Senator John McCain, about a POW, and I say he's done. There's just no way this guy survives. I didn't even comment on him. I just moved on and talked about something else. And he survived. And he survived. And so I look at that and say, you know, if you listen to the national press clips today, you'd think no. In fact, he glibly said, I'm going to watch and figure out who my next vice president is going to be. But I actually think in the end, I still believe, I'm not holding out hope, I just believe that I think he will still show up for this simple reason. He's not conventional. This guy's a prize fighter. Whether you agree with him or not, this is a guy, a prize fighter belongs in the ring. And I don't think when all is said, he can resist the idea that there's going to be 8, maybe 9 or 10 people here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with all this national attention, and he's not going to be the one there to talk about it. And frankly, if I was advising him, I'd tell him to come.
Have you talked to him recently?
I have not talked to him since before I was governor. All right, I take that back. I saw him at one of the campaign debates in 2020, but I haven't seen him since he's been president.
You're close with former Vice President Mike Pence. He just qualified last night, the 8th candidate to do so, to qualify to participate on the stage. He's made a lot of headlines in the last week with the new indictment. I'm curious, from your perspective, did he make the right decision on January 6th?
We followed the Constitution. I understand why people are frustrated about it, but I have repeatedly been asked about this. I like to pull out the Constitution and actually look at it. Something I should say, by the way, on a different issue, I wish 4 justices on the Wisconsin Supreme Court would look at, because the Constitution clearly says that the Chief Justice administers the court, but that's a whole other debate. But the Constitution of the United States explicitly says what the President of the Senate does in terms of the Electoral College. And no matter what you think about, you know, who should or shouldn't be president, I mean, if you could change, don't you think Al Gore would have picked himself? I mean, he was the President of the Senate in January of 2001. You can't. The Constitution is as clear as can be. And so what I've said to people who were frustrated about that years ago and would say again today is that read the Constitution. One of the things, you know, there are a lot of things, I'll back up for 1 second. I get asked all the time, you know, what do I think about President Trump? Well, the first election, I would say all the time, well, he wasn't my first pick. I'm my first pick. You know, I was the one I wanted to pick for president. And then I helped somebody else, as you recall, win the primary in Wisconsin. But in the end, when I looked at the things that Hillary Clinton stood for and the things that Donald Trump stood for in terms of policy, my beliefs align with where he was at. So I sided with President Trump. Similarly, when it came to the 2020 election. But one of the things I point out to conservatives all the time who raise these issues is, one of the things I particularly liked about what he did wasn't just the U.S. Supreme Court, it was the federal courts. The federal courts were, for years, one of my complaints, I'm not a lawyer, has been that there have been people in the past who put men and women on the court who didn't uphold the Constitution, but tried to impose their own political beliefs, their ideological beliefs. And I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong whether you're Republican or Democrat. I think the role of the judiciary is to uphold the Constitution and those laws duly enacted within it, no more, no less. It's one of the things I always said when people came to me, including people who weren't necessarily Republican, to be a judge along the way. Well, I said, if as conservatives we like people being on the bench, that's one of the strengths that Donald Trump brought to the table, is he put men and women on who upheld the Constitution. How then can those same individuals look at the Constitution, what it says about the President of the Senate, which is the Vice President of the United States, and say he or she, depending on who would be in the future, that person shouldn't do exactly what the Constitution says? It's clear. They may have wanted something else, you know, take that up to the Congress, take it up to the states, but I don't think there was any other choice if he was going to follow the Constitution.
As we look at the facts that have come out in the most recent indictment, do they disqualify Donald Trump from being president again?
Well, two things. One, as it is with any of these issues, the voters ultimately get to decide in that regard. I look at the latest, though, and again, I'm not defending nor attacking President Trump. We'll see what happens throughout the primary process. We'll see who the final candidates are in that regard. But I personally look at that and say, I denounced the things that happened on January 6th. I said it that day. I would say it again about individuals involved. But I think in a society, separate what you think about Donald Trump, separate what you think about politics, and say, if you can indict someone for something they said at a podium or something they said on Twitter that then someone else may or may not have acted out on, where do you draw the line? Bernie Sanders said a whole lot of things about Republicans in the House, and some nut went out and opened fire on Steve Scalise and a bunch of other Republicans on a baseball field in Arlington, Virginia. Now, you could say, if you use that same logic, that Bernie Sanders should be indicted for that. I think that's ridiculous. We don't say that in a free society. You could say that Chuck Schumer stood outside the U.S. Capitol and specifically mentioned members of the United States Supreme Court by name in talking about the abortion issue and said they need to be held accountable. And then we later found that not only did people protest in direct violation of federal code in front, you cannot intimidate an officer of the court. Chief Supreme Court Justice, federal judge, other officers of the court. So not only did they protest in front of their homes, which I think would fairly be argued as intimidation, one of them actually talked about going into the home of Justice Kavanaugh and assassinating him. Now again, I don't think Chuck Schumer is responsible for those actions. But if words incite, how is that inconsistent with all those others? So to me, if I look at all that, and again, you look at the Constitution, not only does the First Amendment guarantee the freedom of speech, it guarantees people the right to petition their government for grievances, for relief from grievances. If he believes there were grievances, you don't have to agree with it or not. I've raised concerns about elections, but I haven't gone to the point of saying that I thought there was a remedy to alter some of or to change some of the things that happened in the 2020 election. But I think it's pretty clear by his public statements, he felt there were grievances for that election. I think it is really, really difficult if you separate him, his politics, his personality from those things and apply them to other people in similar circumstances to think what the pattern is if we indict people based on that. I think in the end, the most important thing is the voters. The voters here in Wisconsin, the voters in all the rest of the other 49 states in the District of Columbia should have the say in terms of who the presidential nominee is for each party and ultimately who the President of the United States is.
You want my broadcast voice then? All right. You have 5 young voters here in the building. And you talked about, you think it's indoctrination that's happening on college campuses. But when you look at the gap with what Republicans are saying and what young voters are hearing, whether it be the social issues, concerns about diversity, concerns about where the country should be on abortion, and where economic issues should be. What do you think is the biggest gap between what Republicans are saying and what young people are hearing, and how will you change that the night of the debate, because you're helping to formulate questions, right?
Yeah, we've actually had a number of students at our recent conference on tape. We'll see how much the moderators use. As many of you know, having been moderators of panels as well, it's to their discretion. But we had a number of college students, in this case, that we had at a recent conference, tape questions that they'd like the candidates to be asked and to be able to answer. So that's a part of it. We'll see how much. Again, we're a partner. We're not the driving force. But to the heart of your larger question, I would add one qualifier to the setup of that is not just what Republicans or conservatives are saying, but what's being heard, what's being broadcast, what's being told. Because I think there's a lot of us who talk about economic opportunity and freedom for all, who talk about, there's a balance between, do you believe that the clumsy hand of the government should determine your future, or do you believe that we should put the destiny in your control? As long as you don't hurt the health and safety of your neighbor, go and do your own thing. I think to the young people here and the others you represent, if any of you want to start your business someday, I'd say, wouldn't you love to have a government that says, as long as you're not hurting the health and safety of those around you, go do your own thing, live your own life. We don't need layer after layer after layer of red tape. We don't need all sorts of bureaucrats telling you what and when and where, how you can do it. To me, I always think about the example of you put it in an image. It's like the difference between a taxi and an Uber or a Lyft. Taxis have all these fees and taxes and restrictions and barriers, and certain people are limited as to who can drive and who can't. not so much here, but particularly a city like New York, where you literally got to get a medallion on it, and you got to be registered. There's only a select number that can have that. Versus Uber or Lyft, it just says, hey, you want to do it as a living? Go and do it. You want to do it every once in a while as a hobby, just to have some fun, make a little extra cash? You can do it. Those rideshare programs say, as long as you get a passenger from here to there and they're safe, you're safe and the passenger's safe, we don't care. Go do your thing. That, to me, is a message as a conservative. It's at the heart of what I would say to young people or anyone else in that regard.
So
Our fundamental sense is, if you want to live your life, if you want to start your business, if you want to pursue a career, you want to have a family, go do your own thing. We don't think the government should be a barrier to that. But to your heart of your question is that oftentimes you hear all these other things. And occasionally it's not just the media or social media doing it. Sometimes it's some people profess to be on our side, adding all sorts of other things that kind of cloud that message along the way.
So do you think the Republican Party is missing the mark by not talking about the advantages that can come with diversity? Do you think they have a message? I mean, the state Republicans had a run on an 1849 abortion law in this state. So does there need to be different messaging on those two key issues?
Sure. Well, in terms of the law on that particular issue and the right to life in Wisconsin, the law I signed is 20 weeks. Essentially halfway through a pregnancy, versus where most candidates are in the opposing view of mine, which is all the way to the life of the child's born. That's a radical position in my view. Halfway through versus the very last minute before a child is born. That's where the distinction is. I think they're missing the gap and not talking about the gap there. But in the larger sense, I think on all these other issues, talk to me, I think diversity is great. I think on our college campuses and universities and schools, that should also include diversity of thought. That diversity isn't just about what we look at on the outside, it's what we feel and how we think and what our beliefs are inside our minds, inside our hearts, inside our souls. And we should be celebrating all of that.
Was it a bad move then by Republicans in the legislature to cut diversity, equity, inclusion from the UW system and the city of Milwaukee?
Well, to me, the best answer, if we're talking about how to deal with these issues, is what Morgan Freeman said years ago to Mike Wallace on CBS 60 Minutes. He said, stop talking about it and start treating people with the respect that they deserve. Instead of creating all these other programs, which then, in effect, create divisions based on race and sex and gender, pitting one group versus another, why not say, you know what, if we just taught respect for each other, if we taught people to be decent to each other, if we taught people to stand up and respect people for what they are, the God-given rights that they have in this country and the value that they bring, we'd be far better off. I actually think a lot of those programs and the basis there are right now actually cause more challenges. Because in the end, you see this in polling statistics out there, that you start creating greater divisions out there. Instead of saying, I mean, I had my kids were both in Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout. I had a friend of mine who's involved in Scouts tell me there was a new merit badge in that regard. And he asked, what's your sense about it? I said, if you look as a Scout, Scout's trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, thrifty, brave, clean, reverent. If you do all those things, you don't need a separate program to do that, because if you treat people the way you want to be treated, that's the way I learned in the church. God said to love the Lord with all your heart and all your soul, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. You can't be racist. You can't be discriminatory if you follow those things. If we just got back to that, not only Milwaukee and Wisconsin, but across the country and around the world, we'd be a far better society. Instead of saying, okay, it's based on this and that, pretty soon it'll be hard to keep track of all the different distinctions that are out there. Just treat people with respect. Treat them the way you'd want to be treated. We'd be far better off with that. By the way, part of the reason why our college students need so many scholarships, and that is because tuition nationwide, not just in Wisconsin, has gone up 4 times the rate of inflation since Ronald Reagan was president, and the number of tenured professors has gone on down almost proportionally in the opposite direction. And we have all this student loan debt in large part because the administrative side of the university systems, public and private in our country, don't match with actually putting money in the classroom. That's where our students need the help. And that would be a tremendous relief in terms of them not taking on all the student loan debt.
when you look to the youth vote next year specifically, and let's talk here in Wisconsin, we've seen private conversations nationally among some Republicans looking to restrict the vote on college campuses. We've seen Republicans dismiss early voting, absentee voting for years. How do you mesh that in what you're trying to do?
Well, in our case, I can speak for you not only with the organization, but personally. I don't think, I have no interest in changing the vote in terms of the voting age. Someone recently tried to distinguish. I had actually said something about the voting, the drinking, the age in which you can go to the military should all be the same. He said, "Oh, you're trying to raise it to 21." I said, "No, actually, I think it should be 18." After years of looking at this, I think binge drinking is worse on college campuses since we moved it to 21. I was the last class. Get this, I missed the drinking age when it was 19. I was 18. I missed it by that year. And then I missed it when it went to 21. And what I've seen in all those years, I remember the student orientation down the way here at Marquette literally had the setup for the kegs, but the kegs were missing because the drinking age changed. And I look at it, if you look statistically, particularly down the way at Madison, but elsewhere around the country, raising the drinking age only pushed it off campus and increased binge drinking. There's no other way to read that data. And I get it, Matt and others were trying to keep, high school students off the road. But there's a whole lot of things we could do differently about that. Now, I get there's some nuances. I didn't push it as governor because unless you can get some help from the federal government, you lose all this federal aid. But I think universally, not just here in Wisconsin, but across the country, everything should be 18. If you can go to war and die for your country at 18, you should be able to do any of those other things legally. And so that's just an aside. But on the voting part, no, I think our quest is we need to do a better job, and we need to do it sooner at younger ages and in better ways. One thing I'm particularly proud of our group is we just surpassed this year 1 billion views on our YouTube page. So we have a channel called YAF TV. We have people like Ben Shapiro, oldies like Art Laffer, Katie Pavlich, you name it, all these different folks on there. And you know why we have so many views? 1.5 million, we're on our way to 1.5 million subscribers, over 1 billion views. It's because when we go on campus, whether it's at UW-Whitewater, UW-Madison, UW-Milwaukee, Marquette, you name it, across here and across the country, our speakers take questions and they let people who disagree with them go to the front of the line. And they actually have a dialogue. And you wouldn't believe how many young people are hungry for this because they haven't heard it in the classroom by and large. They haven't heard it elsewhere on campus. They like to hear a dialogue of different points of view, and it drives our numbers through the roof. One of those we had recently with Ben Shapiro, one of our speakers, had 23 million views on it. We think the more we get that information off, the better off we're going to be. So at least for me and those I work with, we're not afraid of young people voting. What we're afraid of is young people voting and never hearing the other side of the equation.
We've talked a lot about the presidential race, but Tammy Baldwin's running for re-election in the Senate. We know you're not running, but who would you like to see get into that race?
I'm biased that he's not running, but Mike Gallagher used to work for me. He's a great guy, wonderful congressman. I think does tremendous things. He would have been a great candidate on many different levels. He's a rational, reasonable, responsible person. Maybe that's why he's not running for the Senate. He just, circumstances, family, all those other things right now. I think it'll be tough. It's funny. Tammy Baldwin and I used to serve in the legislature together. She was ranking member of the committee I chaired. When she first ran for Congress, I think it was the Cap Times actually, asked me about her because she and I got along. Hard to believe politically, right? But Tammy and I get along just fine. Gwen Moore and I actually get along. We used to chair a committee together too, personally. Our politics are aligned. But I remember the Cap Times reporter, long before you were there, said to me, "Oh, what do you think about then State Representative Tammy Baldwin?" I said, she's really insightful, very thoughtful. She makes some of the best arguments that I've ever heard for some of the worst ideas possible. Because our politics weren't aligned. But I enjoyed. We had a good dialogue. We got along, and I'll give her credit. You'll appreciate this when I sing about the foundation. One of the things she does well is she follows her Coles model in the sense that it has really sound constituency work. I've seen that. Has some good staff working for her along the way. I don't agree with her voting record, but I think it's going to be a challenge because she's done a ton of work to set the table for her reelection. Now, could that change? Yeah, but you'd have to have somebody pretty strong come up. And it's not just about money, although she's got a lot of that, most of which comes from outside of the state of Wisconsin. But it's going to have to take a message that even if President Biden were to lose, this state's had a long record. I mean, think about Tommy Thompson and Russ Feingold get reelected in the same year. We've got a long record. We like people. We like to have, at least a good chunk of our voters like to feel like I'm not wed to one. I may trend one way or the other, but a good chunk of people in Wisconsin feel strongly enough about being, even if they're not independents, saying I can vote for one person for one party and somebody else for the other. And so whoever has to run for that has to make that case, not just about, even if President Biden were to lose not only overall, but lose Wisconsin, that somehow Senator Baldwin is a part of that. And that's going to be, it's not impossible, but it's going to be a challenge.
One of your last acts as governor was signing what was known at that time lame duck legislation to restrict some of the powers of the Attorney General as well as the governor. At that time, when you signed it, defending the measure, saying it will improve transparency, stability, and accountability, you also said there's a lot of hype and hysteria around this. You mentioned the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Is that a lot of hype and hysteria about the power shift that's happened there?
No, and back for 1 second on the other part, we just essentially codified things I'd been doing for 8 years. So it wasn't anything new that changed the last minute. It codified the things that we had done in terms of the relationship with the legislature and with those other offices you mentioned. In terms of Supreme Court, we'll see what the decisions are. And I've said this before. When you talk about congressional boundaries and legislative boundaries, those are all over. That's a wide open effort, no matter whether it's Republican, Democrat. Those are always, somebody can point and say, well, this tweak or that tweak. I think the key will be if the courts throw them out, which I think is likely, just based upon what the newest justice has said during the campaign. I'd be curious as to what the standards are for new maps. Because historically, conservative or liberal or activist, however you want to define the justices, historically, the distinction has included things like top priority, both at the state and federal courts, has been maintaining, protecting the Voting Rights Act. It's been typically, historically, about keeping communities of interest intact. Because I remember back as a kid, if you studied gerrymandering, it wasn't Republican or Democrat, it was examples of, I used to call it the wagon wheel, where somebody would go into one city and they'd draw lines out all the way through the city to the suburbs and create districts that were completely unrelated geographically and otherwise, but to help benefit certain political advantages one way or the other. And you see him, sometimes you'd hear him talk about them following freeways in certain states and things of that nature. So they can throw them out, but the question then becomes, what are the standards for new maps? Because historically, either party, the maps that have been upheld by courts that have been all over the map have been maps that have communities of interest, but most importantly have the Voting Rights Act intact, that keep the numbers as consistent as possible so you don't have a big gap between one district or another along the way. Other things, I like to think that Justice Ann Walsh-Bradley has been around a long enough time. She's shown a considerable judicial restraint along the way that if no one else, at least her, even with the new 4-3 margins, would say on something like Act 10, the act that I promoted that probably got the most attention, if the court were to throw that out, that sets a horrible precedent. Because basically what it says, if someday a Democrat legislature, Democrat-controlled legislature, and a Democrat governor pass something, and then sometime after that a conservative-leaning majority come in, if you follow the tit for tat, now I'm not advocating for that, they'd say, oh, we're going to throw that out. Well, I would argue against that, even if it might be to my advantage, because that's not what the courts are for. You elect the legislature, you elect a governor to pass laws, sign them, and enact them. You elect the courts to see whether or not they uphold to the Constitution and to the rule of law. So I think on some of those other issues, it becomes much, much more complicated. But initially on the administration of the court, I would defy all of you. It doesn't sound like a very exciting thing to do, but when you go home or go to the office, wherever you're going next, bring up on Google or whatever your search engine is, the Wisconsin State's Constitution, look at the judiciary, and look at the administration of the courts. It's unequivocal. That is the responsibility of the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice, the current Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court has a term that goes through the middle of 2025. And so they just fired the director of the state court, someone, the Wisconsin State Bar Association, hardly a conservative organization, just gave an award to for the administration of the court, particularly during COVID and the pandemic and other accolades along the way. So not exactly someone that any of the justices, no matter what their beliefs are, was highlighting as problematic. They just fired him without the Chief Justice having any say over that. The Director of Chief Courts doesn't just run the Supreme Court's administrative side. Any of the judges that are here know, for the Court of Appeals and the Circuit Court here in Milwaukee County and every other circuit across the state, that's the person who administers the court. It's pretty clear. Constitution says that's the responsibility of the Chief Justice. If conservatives had done that when Shirley Abrahamson was the Chief Justice, there'd be a total meltdown. Every newspaper in the state would be writing editorials about how outrageous this is, how condescending it was to the longest-serving justice on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But it happens to Chief Justice Ziegler, and there's hardly a peep out there. I just think it's an incredible double standard. And I think particularly in anything, but particularly when it comes to judiciary, that should not be a place where we have to worry about double standards when it comes to politics. So looks like I'm getting the hook. But thanks, everybody. Good to be with you.
I'd like to thank our panel of journalists for their questions, and now we have a few minutes. We'd like to get some questions from all of you. So if you have a question, please come up to the microphone over here, and here we go.
Hi, Governor Walker.
Hi.
I'm glad to hear that you're keeping the voting age question at 18. That's certainly a good thing. The Shirley Abrahamson issue, she was deposed because of conservative belief that it was no longer going to be the longstanding Chief Justice versus the vote. I apologize, this will be a little bit long. You and I both agree that Ronald Reagan was impactful, but we disagree on whether that was a good thing. He seemed to be the beginning of the changes in Republicans' positions on subjects like the environment. Whereas under Richard Nixon's administration, the EPA was founded, we now have descended into an anti-science, anti-climate change mindset, where drill, baby, drill was a legitimate political slogan by the future head of the RNC in 2008. And it's gotten worse since. This week, Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times that climate change beliefs have become part of the culture war. As recently as the mid-2000s, Republicans and Democrats both had similar levels of trust in the scientific community. Since then, however, Republican trust has plunged as Democratic trust has risen. There's now a 30-point gap between the parties. Republicans at the Heritage Foundation are spearheading an effort called Project 225 that calls for dismantling almost every clean energy program in the federal government and boosting the production of fossil fuels. Doing this would cement our path to a rapidly warming world. Do you believe in climate change? And if so, how will you be guiding young people to make sure that they have a future world and a healthy environment to enjoy?
I'd love to have the United States lead the way in the world to planting 1 trillion more trees. Because anyone who's ever taken science, even if it's just basic K through 12 science, knows that plants, like trees, need carbon. And trees and other plants create oxygen. To me, something like that would have a tremendous impact here and around the world, as opposed to many of the ideas, at least you make reference to, that end up doing things to cripple the United States economy without having benefit of places like India or China abiding by the same standards. Now, many of you are too young, but those of you my age or older remember we used to go out to eat long before here in Wisconsin, around the country, they changed the laws. There used to be smoking sections in one part of the restaurant, and then over here, there'd be non-smoking. And usually there'd be a little like booth with a window or a piece of glass maybe this big that somehow was protecting us from the smoking section. And if you sat in that section, if there were enough people smoking, you'd see the smoke glide across to the non-smoking section. That's what these ideas are like if you don't have China and India doing anything about it. You're tying the hands of the United States and their economy, while China and India consistently do things. While we've seen in the last decade dramatic reductions in emissions in the United States, even during the Trump administration. You don't see that kind of stuff in those major industrial powers in the world. And so to me, we've got to find ways to deal with this issue that actually have an impact. And so there are things we can do that help us address that issue without crippling our economy and actually have a major impact on the world, not just the United States. I'm going to take his question next. I answered your question. We're not debating. You're going to have a debate with somebody else, but I'm going to take his question.
This question has two parts. Do you like to golf?
No.
So when you fast-tracked the permit with the DNR for the Kohler new golf course, were you aware that there were Native American remains on the land?
I didn't get into the details of that. You can ask some of the folks who've been involved there, but
That case is now before the Court of Appeals here in Wisconsin, and as I was looking into your campaign finance records, I saw that you accepted $84,000 in donations from Kohler before you fast-tracked that permit. Was that a coincidence?
similar to the pattern that Governor Doyle, who was a big fan and actually golfed that course quite a bit, who was an advocate for golf. I think he and I think Governor Evers and others have put a lot of attention on that site and other places around the state that have a major impact on tourism and economic vitality, whether it's in Sheboygan County or in the middle of the state or elsewhere.
Now that they found the human remains from Native American tribes, do you believe they should continue building the golf course?
I'll leave that up to the current administration.
Thank you.
Now I'm really getting the hooks up.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.